Bobby Fischer's opponent makes a real mistake against the great Fischer in this game. It is a mistake that is all too common, particularly when someone is playing someone that is a bit better than they are. And that mistake is to play passively. When you played passively against Bobby Fischer, he found a way to just whip his pieces into a frenzy and just get all over you. And that's what happens in this game. His opponent, Goodmanson, I don't know a whole lot about him. But he's from Iceland. This was played in 1960 in Reykjavik, Iceland. He had the white pieces. Fischer had the black pieces. Let's jump right in and see how Fischer deals with an opponent who's trying to hide in safety. White begins with d4. Fischer plays knight to f6, knight f3, d5, and e3. And this looks like the beginning of the Kali system. Perhaps the bishop could go to d3. So Fischer plays g6 just in case, so that the bishop on d3 would bite on granite with the pawn on g6. And then Goodmanson decides to change his strategy a little bit, seeing that, and goes ahead and plays c4. Attacks the center in a more traditional Queen's Gambit-like fashion. Bishop to g7 by Fischer, knight to c3 and castles, and we have transposed into a Grunfeld system. And after queen to b3, where Goodmanson is putting as much pressure on d5 as he possibly can with the pawn, knight, and queen, we've reached a position that is common today. Caruana has played this position. Abdusattorov has played this position. This is still a very common position in modern chess. Fischer plays e6 here to support his pawn on d5. Bishop e2. And notice how White continues to play unambitiously, playing, hoping that they can just play it safe and maybe get a draw against Fischer. Fischer plays the move knight to c6 here. Usually the rule is you don't want to block this pawn on c7 in Queen's pawn opening lines. But Fischer has a concrete reason why he wants to develop the knight to c6. As you can see here, after knight to c6, he's immediately threatening knight to a5, which would hit the queen and the pawn, and the knight taking the pawn, even if he were to get it exchanged off for equal material, would still favor Fischer quite a bit. He would get the light-squared bishop off the board. So White can't allow that, and he's got two ways to prevent it. He could take on d5 with the pawn. The problem is after ed5, this bishop at c8 is no longer blocked and could later develop much more actively at f5 or g4. So instead, Goodmanson plays queen to c2 to get away from the knight threat on a5. Fischer takes on c4, bishop takes c4, and now we see the second purpose of developing the knight directly to c6. It supports the e5 push. So Fischer gets his key pawn break in, and you'll notice Goodmanson's king is still in the middle of the board. So Fischer already has some serious pressure on White's position. Pawn takes and knight to g4. You can see Fischer is recovering the pawn. He's got three options to retake it. The pawn is only defended one time. Castles, knight ce5, knight e5, knight e5, hitting the bishop at c4, so that bishop retreats to e2, and c6. This pawn at c6 keeps this knight on c3 in check. It can't go to b5. It can't go to d5. So up to this point, Goodmanson, he has an equal position, but he's never even come close to getting an advantage with the white pieces. Let's see now how Fischer is able to whip up piece activity against his opponent, who's playing, again, a little too passively. White plays f4, and he's gaining space. He's hitting the knight, so Fischer has to do something, and maybe he's thinking he can advance the e-pawn and attack with the e and f pawns on the king side. Fischer plays knight to g4, putting some pressure on e3. Perhaps he could play rook to e8 and put some more pressure on that square. h3 kicks the knight away. Now, it would be far too passive for Fischer to play knight to h6. So he plays an intermediate move. He plays a lot of intermediate attacking moves in his games. He plays the move bishop to f5, immediately going after the queen. Now, it looks like a blunder at first, right? Isn't White winning a piece after e4? That's what he played. Well, not exactly. It turns out queen to b3, attacking the b7 pawn, would be the best way for White to achieve equality. But he's tempted and plays e4. And now we see the knight on g4 and the bishop in f5 are both hanging. So can Fischer save the material and get compensation? Well, he begins with queen to d4 check. So you have to respond to that. King to h1 is really forced. Knight to f2 check. And if the king were to move, to h2, then just knight takes e4, and in this case, black is winning with an extra pawn in a great position. So Gudmundsson has to take the knight and try to get 2 minor pieces for a rook and get compensation. So rook takes knight, queen takes, and then ef5. So he has gotten 2 minor pieces for the rook, and he has the bishop pair. So it looks like he's getting compensation. But here Fischer makes a move that at first sight is shocking. It looks like a strategic blunder in a way. He plays bishop takes knight. He takes the knight on c3, and you can't retake with the queen, otherwise you would lose the bishop on e2. So he takes with the pawn. So Gudmundsson has 2 bishops for a rook, and normally we would say that's a very good exchange of value for white. We would rather have 2 bishops than a rook. But Fischer has looked deeply into this position. Now notice Fischer's rooks, h8 and f8. These are very passively placed. Look how quickly Fischer is able to get those rooks super active. I mean, it happens immediately. You just look at these passive rooks. Well, how can it be? Well, first he plays rook a to e8, threatening to win a piece, attacking the bishop on e2. So that bishop moves to d3 to save itself. Rook to e1 check, king h2, queen to g1 check, king g3, and rook f to e8. And just like that, the 2 rooks are completely active and all over white's position. Now, king to h4 is probably the best move, but Fischer can still play queen to c5, threaten queen to d6, and he still is in control of the position. What if white tried to exchange queens and say, take advantage of the 2 bishops in the endgame? Well, this would be a blunder because of this move. Rook 8 to e3 check, and after bishop takes rook, rook takes, you either push the king away from the defense of the queen, or you have to just play queen takes rook, which is what you would play, but then queen takes, and obviously queen versus rook. Fischer would be completely winning in this position. So Gudmundsson plays rook to b1, trying to defend this rook and relieve any pressure that's on the c1 bishop. But Fischer takes the pawn at f5, a very strong move, opening up the g file in an attempt to get at white's king. Perhaps he can play king h8, rook g8, or the rook e6, g6 ideas I have drawn on the board. If bishop takes pawn, and that of course controls this e6 square, then rook 8 to e2, attacking the queen and the g2 pawn, bishop h7, king h8, queen to f5, then rook g2 check, king h4, queen f2 check, and this leads to mate after, say, king h5, and then rook to e6, aiming at the h6 square, and white is completely lost in that case. So instead, white plays bishop to d2, hoping to just exchange some pieces and relieve the pressure, and maybe those 2 bishops will help in the endgame. Well, Fischer obliges. He takes the rook on b1, queen takes, and then queen takes b1, bishop takes b1. So now he has what he wanted, the 2 bishops against a rook in an endgame. There's only one problem, concrete analysis, and Fischer plays this move, rook to e2, hitting the bishop on d2. And in this position, white resigned, because the only square that bishop can go to and not be immediately captured is c1, and then rook to e1, skewering the 2 bishops, winning the exchange and the game. A clear display of how a great player handles an opponent who's playing overly safe and trying to curl up into a ball and sort of hold on for the end. It doesn't work. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.